Moneyweb at midday for all your up-to-date stories.
By 2050, 1 in every 4 people on the planet is expected to be African. That extraordinary population growth could give the continent far greater economic, cultural and political influence. But without jobs, without education, without functioning institutions and deeper economic integration, it could also intensify equality, migration and instability. In his new book, it's called The Invisible People, former MTN Chief Executive Phuthuma Nhleko argues that Africa remains largely invisible in the global economy and in many of the institutions where international power is exercised. He goes on to say that the continent needs a new renaissance, built, he says, on a stronger sense of identity, of greater economic cooperation, technological innovation, and a more confident collective voice. So I want to explore that in a lot more detail. Phuthuma Nhleko, a very warm welcome to you. Maybe let's start with a contextual question, if I can. It's in the title. Who are the invisible people? But more importantly, invisible to whom?
Well, the invisibility is, as I put it in the book, it's the invisibility to the rest of the world. You know, I feel that Africa is, in many respects, on a number of matters and areas, whether it's commerce, whether it's geopolitics and so on. We're very much on the periphery. So we are invisible to a great part of the world. But in many respects, we're also invisible to ourselves, in the sense that there has been a huge detachment between the historical line of Africans, their history, their contributions, and how they see themselves today. So it's a double invisibility, if you like. And I think that's where I speak to somebody like W.E. Du Bois, who really explains this concept, I think, quite masterfully.
I'm wondering if Africa is invisible because the world then chooses not to see us, or do you think it's because the continent has failed to project not only its power, but also its potential?
Yeah, it's really the latter. I think the days of victimhood are gone. They are passé. Of course, the world sees you to the extent you want to be seen. So we all know the tragic historical history, certainly of the last 500 years, 600 years. But we are in a position now to assert ourselves. We're in a position to leverage the population dividend, which of course can become a liability if we don't have some of the foundational pillars that I spoke about. So really, it's up to us to leverage it. So it's more the latter in what you've described, is that we need to be on the front foot. We need to begin to engage in long-range planning, and we really need to move forward in a manner that is in our self-enlightened interest. So that's the way that I see that.
It's interesting that you reference the date 2050. As I said in my introduction, roughly a quarter of the world's population could be African. Why, Phuthuma, is that statistic so central to the book?
Well, that statistic is, there's nothing absolutely magical about it. I mean, apart from the fact that it is half century. And if you look at or review a lot of stats from, a whole range of institutions, including the United Nations and so on, that's when we expect to have a really fundamental pivot on the demographics of many countries. So I would say that, that's when, for instance, you'd expect by around 2042 that the composition of the African-American demographics or American demographics would be majority black and brown. That's by when you would expect that, almost 50% of the youth under 18 years of age would be on this continent. So it does point to that date, but there's nothing absolutely magic about it. It could be 2040 and so on, but I just think 2050 is actually quite an important marker.
All right, let me follow up on that then. What happens if the continent reaches that point without, as you've suggested in the book, creating enough jobs, industries, and functioning cities?
Then we are really or on the path to a ticking time bomb, aren't we? Because the essence of the thesis of the book is that the rate at which this population is growing, if you look at that trend, and you look at the trend that would describe the amount of capacity to be provided in food, health, education, and so on, that trend, albeit rising, is rising very, very gradually. So that divergence is really what describes the huge danger that we face if we don't have those institutions and that capacity and those pillars in place. In fact, I describe in the book that, every time you watch television these days, you often see huge migration across the Sahel and across the Mediterranean into Europe. That is really a drop in the ocean. If these pillars are not put in place, that capacity is not put in place, that ensures that the needs of those millions and millions of people are addressed on the African continent. Even Europe will not have the luxury to turn a blind eye to this because they will be hugely impacted. And we're seeing that already. So I think the simple answer to your very simple question is if those things are not put in place, we then have enormous socioeconomic tensions that will engulf everybody, including Europe in particular.
Phuthuma, let me push you a little further on Africa's population growth then. In the book itself, you describe it as a potential source of strength. Obviously, a lot of other people would view it as a looming crisis. How narrow, then, do you think that window is in which governments need to act quickly? And you referenced long-range planning. Do we have the luxury of long-range planning in this respect?
Well, it's an imperative. And let me start off by saying that it is a dividend, it is a potential source of strength. But that source of strength can very rapidly turn into a huge problem and a huge liability. So that's what I'm saying. With respect to, do we have the luxury? No, we don't. It's an imperative. I would say on a timeline, we need to, in the next sort of 5 years, start making some very, very decisive actions as far as preparing for this bulge. Because the other complexity that we have is the fact that technology change is accelerating. Technology is changing at a faster and faster and faster pace. So if you're in China and it was 1949, you had more of a luxury of time to plan for what we're seeing in China today. We have less of that luxury because of technology. There are many indications that almost 30%, for instance, of the relatively unskilled workforce in the United States will be out of a job in 3 years, right? And that's a highly developed country, right?
Yeah.
So can you imagine what it means for the African countries where some are still even trying to emerge out of, the second and third industrial revolution, let alone the fourth, or entering the fourth. So the timeline is limited. I would say the window of 5 years, primarily because of technological change, is the kind of time window that we have. If we don't act within that window, I think the African continent will then be left behind even more substantially than it is today.
In conversation there with Phuthuma Nhleko, who's the author of the book The Invisible People. He's also former Chief Executive Officer of MTN. The full interview can be seen on Moneyweb TV on moneyweb.co.za.